American armor had dominated the European theater. Heavy tanks had broken German lines, crushed fortifications, and provided mobile firepower across open terrain. By the early 1960s, the United States Army maintained one of the most capable armored forces in the world. Doctrine emphasized speed, firepower, and combined arms coordination. Tank units trained for rapid maneuver warfare across varied landscapes. The M48 Patton medium tank represented the culmination of post-World War II armored development, incorporating lessons from Korea and Cold War European deployments. Vietnam presented a different environment entirely. The decision to deploy armored units to Southeast Asia reflected expectations based on previous conflicts. Planners anticipated that tanks would provide fire support, convoy protection, and psychological advantage. The M48 Patton medium tank, which had proven effective in Korea, seemed suitable for the role. Initial deployments began in 1960, with limited numbers of M48A3 variants assigned to cavalry squadrons and armored battalions. These units arrived expecting to employ conventional armored tactics, adapted for tropical conditions. The reality would prove far more complex. The Mekong Delta region consisted primarily of rice paddies, marshland, and waterways. Solid ground existed in limited areas, primarily along roads, dikes, and in villages built on higher ground. Rice paddy dikes, constructed of packed earth and maintained by generations of farmers, could not support the weight of a 50-ton tank. The M48 Patton exerted approximately 13 pounds per square inch of ground pressure. Wet paddies offered far less load-bearing capacity. Tanks attempting to cross flooded fields sank axle-deep into mud. The suction created by thick mud made extraction extraordinarily difficult. Recovery operations required specialized equipment and hours of effort, often under threat of enemy fire. The Central Highlands presented different but equally severe challenges. Dense triple canopy jungle covered much of the interior. Primary vegetation grew to heights exceeding 100 feet, with trunks thick enough to stop most vehicles. Secondary growth beneath the canopy created layers of vines, bamboo, and undergrowth so dense that infantry could barely push through. Visibility from a tank commander's position rarely exceeded 10 to 15 meters in jungle terrain. Traditional armor tactics relied on observation ranges measured in hundreds of meters or more. In dense vegetation, crews operated effectively blind, unable to identify threats until they were dangerously close. Road networks in South Vietnam were limited and poorly maintained. Highway 1, running along the coast, provided the primary north-south route, but even this main artery suffered from inadequate maintenance and regular damage from both weather and enemy action. Secondary roads consisted of packed earth or gravel, serviceable during dry season but transformed into impassable mud tracks during monsoon rains. Bridges throughout the country were designed for local traffic, not military vehicles weighing 50 tons. Engineers regularly evaluated weight limits before armor could cross. Many structures required reinforcement or complete bypass construction, adding days to movement timelines. Tank movement generated distinct signatures that eliminated tactical surprise. The sound of a tracked vehicle carried considerable distances through jungle terrain, particularly in the early morning or evening hours when atmospheric conditions favored sound transmission. Engine noise, track clatter, and the sound of crushing vegetation announced the presence of armor long before visual contact became possible. Enemy forces used these acoustic signatures to prepare ambushes or withdraw before engagement. The element of surprise, fundamental to armored warfare doctrine developed in Europe, proved difficult to achieve. Experienced enemy commanders could estimate the size and composition of armored units simply by listening to engine sounds and track patterns. Maneuver space restrictions limited tactical options in ways that contradicted decades of armor doctrine. Jungle tracks and cleared areas formed natural corridors that channeled movement into predictable patterns. Tank commanders possessed limited ability to choose advantageous positions or develop the situation through maneuver. Movement occurred along predictable routes that enemy forces could easily observe and target. Flanking maneuvers, a cornerstone of armor tactics since World War I, became impractical in terrain offering no room for deployment off primary routes. Units often operated in single file, maximizing vulnerability to ambush, while minimizing their ability to bring concentrated firepower to bear. The threat environment in Vietnam differed fundamentally from conventional armored warfare scenarios. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces rarely fielded tanks in significant numbers during the early years of American involvement. Anti-tank weapons included rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless rifles, and command-detonated mines constructed from various explosive sources. These weapons proved devastatingly effective in close terrain where tanks could not maintain standoff distance. An RPG team positioned in dense vegetation could engage at ranges under 50 meters, fire, and disappear into the jungle before return fire proved effective. The shape-charge warhead could penetrate side and rear armor, and even frontal armor if the angle proved favorable. Mines represented a persistent and psychologically draining threat. The M48 Patton's belly armor provided protection against pressure-activated anti-tank mines common in European conflicts. Vietnamese forces employed command-detonated mines constructed from unexploded ordnance, captured munitions, and locally manufactured explosives. These devices, placed in predictable choke points along roads and trails, could disable or destroy tanks with careful timing. Mine strikes often occurred in areas where recovery proved extremely difficult, such as bridges, defiles, or sections of road bordered by impassable terrain. The psychological effect of mine warfare extended beyond physical casualties, creating constant stress for crews who understood that any stretch of road might conceal a deadly device. Operational tempo in Vietnam did not favor traditional armored employment patterns. Large-scale armored assaults, which characterized European warfare and remained central to NATO doctrine, found no application in Vietnam's strategic environment. Instead, tank-supported infantry operations provided firebase security or escorted convoys along vulnerable supply routes. Missions often required tanks to remain stationary for extended periods, negating mobility advantages that represented armor's primary value. Crews spent more time in defensive positions than conducting offensive operations. This static employment contradicted training and doctrinal expectations, creating frustration among personnel trained for mobile warfare. Supply requirements for armored units strained logistics systems already challenged by Vietnam's geography. The M48 Patton consumed fuel at rates exceeding 2 gallons per mile under combat conditions. In rough terrain or during extended idle periods with engines running for electrical power, consumption increased significantly. A single tank platoon of 5 vehicles could consume hundreds of gallons daily. Fuel convoys required protection, creating circular support requirements where combat power was diverted to protect the logistics that sustained combat power. Ammunition expenditure, while less dramatic than fuel consumption, still demanded regular resupply. Each M48 carried approximately 60 rounds of 90mm ammunition. Sustained operations or contact with enemy forces depleted basic loads rapidly, requiring resupply runs that exposed support personnel to ambush. Maintenance demands escalated dramatically in tropical conditions. The M48's powertrain, designed for temperate climates, suffered from extreme heat and humidity. Air filtration systems clogged rapidly with fine dust during dry periods, reducing engine efficiency and increasing wear. During monsoons, moisture-infiltrated systems despite seals and covers. Track life decreased substantially on abrasive laterite soil common throughout Vietnam. The reddish soil, while providing reasonable trafficability when dry, wore through rubber track pads and accelerated metal fatigue. Replacement parts required regular shipment from supply depots, often located hundreds of kilometers from forward positions. The parts pipeline stretched back to the United States for specialized components, creating weeks or months of delay. Recovery operations presented unique challenges that absorbed substantial resources. A disabled M48 weighed approximately 48 tons, representing an immense recovery challenge in difficult terrain. Standard recovery vehicles, including the M48 recovery vehicle designed specifically for tank retrieval, could recover tanks on firm ground. In jungle or rice paddy terrain, recovery became extraordinarily complex. Multiple vehicles, heavy equipment including bulldozers and cranes, and substantial time were required. Disabled tanks sometimes remained in place for days while engineers prepared sites for recovery operations, constructing approaches and hard stands capable of supporting recovery equipment. During this period, the disabled vehicle required security, further diverting combat power from operational missions. Crew comfort affected operational capability in ways that conventional doctrine had not adequately considered. Interior temperatures inside a closed M48 could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in tropical sun, even with the vehicle stationary. Operating conditions, during movement when engine heat added to solar heating, became almost unbearable. Crews operated with hatches open when possible, reducing protection but improving survivability, through better visibility and reduced heat stress. Ventilation systems designed for moderate climates proved completely inadequate for tropical operations. Heat exhaustion affected crew performance during extended operations, degrading alertness, decision-making, and physical capability. Commanders faced difficult choices between crew protection and crew effectiveness, often choosing to accept increased vulnerability in exchange for operational capability. Visibility limitations extended far beyond terrain factors. The M48 featured periscopes and vision blocks designed for open terrain warfare where threats appeared at distance. These devices provided limited fields of view and poor resolution in close terrain where threats might appear within meters. Commanders attempting to observe surroundings from the cupola exposed themselves to small arms fire and the ever-present danger of command-detonated mines. Buttoned up, crews relied on narrow vision slits that revealed little of the immediate surroundings. Dead zones existed around the vehicle where enemy infantry could approach undetected. Infantry support became essential for local security, creating the combined arms requirement that doctrine had always emphasized, but that proved absolutely critical in Vietnam's close terrain. Communications equipment functioned inconsistently in jungle conditions. Radio systems aboard the M48 provided adequate range for conventional operations on open terrain. In jungle terrain, dense vegetation and terrain features degraded signal strength substantially. Maintaining contact with supporting infantry, higher headquarters, or adjacent units required careful frequency management and sometimes physical displacement to achieve line-of-sight transmission paths. Coordination difficulties increased the complexity of combined arms operations. Artillery support, medical evacuation, and resupply all depended on reliable communications. Interruptions in radio contact created dangerous situations where isolated units faced threats without the support network that American doctrine assumed would always be available. Armor thickness that provided protection against contemporary anti-tank weapons offered less advantage in Vietnam's combat environment than in conventional scenarios. The M48's frontal armor could defeat most infantry portable weapons at typical engagement ranges on European battlefields. In close terrain, side and rear armor became vulnerable to weapons that could be employed at extremely close range. Shaped charge warheads from RPGs could penetrate armor at close range regardless of angle, given the short distances involved. The psychological advantage of heavy armor diminished when enemy forces could engage from concealed positions at ranges where armor thickness provided limited protection. Crews understood that their protection depended more on situational awareness and supporting infantry than on steel plate. Weapon systems faced employment challenges unique to the Vietnamese environment. The M48's 90mm main gun delivered substantial firepower capable of destroying fortifications and structures. Target acquisition in dense vegetation proved difficult and often impossible. Crews often engaged suspected positions rather than confirmed targets, expending ammunition against areas where enemy forces might be located. High explosive rounds proved effective against structures and fortifications, but offered limited utility against dispersed infantry in jungle terrain. Fragments from high explosive rounds lost energy rapidly in dense vegetation. Coaxial and cupola-mounted machine guns provided better capability against personnel targets when crews could identify them, but the close range and limited visibility made accurate fire difficult. Adaptation occurred gradually as units accumulated operational experience. Armored units modified employment tactics based on hard lessons learned through contact and casualties. Tanks increasingly operated in close coordination with infantry, who provided local security and target identification that tank crews could not achieve alone. Engineers accompanied armored columns to address mobility obstacles and conduct mine clearance operations before tanks entered danger areas. Units developed techniques for crossing difficult terrain, including use of fascines to fill ditches, corduroy roads constructed from local timber to cross soft ground, and careful route reconnaissance that identified viable paths. These adaptations represented practical solutions to immediate problems but could not overcome fundamental environmental constraints. Equipment modifications emerged from field experience as crews sought any advantage that might improve survivability or effectiveness. Crews added sandbags and spare track blocks to vulnerable areas, increasing protection against RPGs and mine fragments. The added weight degraded mobility and increased fuel consumption, but crews accepted these trade-offs for improved protection. Improvised armor shields protected cupola-mounted machine guns, allowing gunners to engage targets with reduced exposure. Units requested and received modifications to air filtration systems and cooling equipment, as the severity of environmental challenges became apparent to higher commands. These adaptations addressed immediate problems, but could not fundamentally alter the mismatch between heavy armor designed for European warfare and the realities of jungle combat. The M113 armored personnel carrier saw more extensive use than tanks in many operational areas. Weighing approximately 12 tons, the M113 exerted lower ground pressure and negotiated soft terrain more successfully than the M48. Its lighter weight made recovery operations simpler and faster, reducing the resource drain of disabled vehicles. The vehicle's open-top design, while reducing protection against overhead threats, improved crew visibility and situational awareness in close terrain. Crews could observe their surroundings more effectively and respond to threats faster. Many units found the M113 more suitable for Vietnam's operational environment than heavier tanks, though this preference emerged only after extensive experience with both vehicle types. Armored cavalry squadrons adapted their organization and tactics substantially from conventional patterns. Traditional cavalry missions emphasized reconnaissance and security operations conducted at speed. In Vietnam, these units performed convoy escort, route clearance, and firebase security missions that bore little resemblance to classic cavalry operations. The mix of tanks, armored personnel carriers, and support vehicles provided flexibility in mission assignment. Cavalry troops often operated independently in remote areas, requiring self-sufficiency in maintenance, supply, and recovery. This independence demanded initiative from junior leaders, who often made decisions far from higher command supervision. Firebase defense became a primary mission for many tank platoons throughout the war. Armor positioned around fire support bases provided direct fire capability against ground assault that infantry weapons could not match. The psychological impact of tanks on the defensive perimeter offered value beyond their actual combat contribution, deterring attacks and providing reassurance to infantry defenders. However, static defensive positions negated mobility advantages that represented armor's primary contribution to combined arms warfare. Tanks became pillboxes, their engines running continuously to power systems, consuming fuel without gaining ground or achieving maneuver. Tankers found themselves in an infantry role, using armor as mobile fortifications rather than maneuver. Weapons, a use that contradicted everything they had trained for. Convoy escort duty consumed substantial armored resources throughout the American presence in Vietnam. Supply routes throughout South Vietnam required protection against ambush, a threat that affected every class of supply movement. Tanks provided heavy firepower and psychological deterrence to convoy escort operations, but the missions themselves created vulnerability. The slow speed of heavy convoys, combined with predictable routes and schedules, created ideal conditions for enemy ambush. Escort missions demanded constant vigilance but offered limited opportunity for offensive action. Crews spent hours moving through potential ambush zones, experiencing sustained stress without contact, then sudden intense violence when ambushes occurred. This pattern of tedium, punctuated by terror, characterized much of armored operations in Vietnam. Urban operations in Vietnamese towns and cities presented unique challenges that armor training had not adequately addressed. Streets designed for civilian traffic, often dating from French colonial administration, could not always accommodate 50-ton tanks. Narrow passages between buildings restricted movement and visibility to dangerous levels. Tank guns, effective at distance on open terrain, proved difficult to employ in close urban terrain where targets appeared at ranges measured in meters. The danger of collateral damage in populated areas restricted employment. Infantry support became absolutely essential in urban terrain. The combination of limited maneuver space and numerous concealment positions created dangerous conditions for armor that could not leverage its advantages in firepower and protection. Training for Vietnam deployment did not adequately prepare crews for operational reality they would encounter. Stateside preparation emphasized conventional armored warfare doctrine developed for European scenarios. Units trained for meeting engagements, defensive positions, and combined arms coordination on open terrain at Fort Knox, Fort Hood, and other training centers. Jungle warfare tactics, close quarters engagement, and adaptation to severe mobility restrictions received limited attention in training programs designed for conventional war. Crews arrived in Vietnam with skill sets only partially applicable to the environment they would encounter, requiring extensive on-the-job learning that cost time, effectiveness, and sometimes lives. Rotation policies affected unit cohesion and experience retention in ways that compounded operational challenges. Individual replacement rather than unit rotation meant that crews constantly changed composition. Experienced personnel departed as new arrivals joined units, creating continuous turbulence in crew dynamics. This steady personnel turnover prevented accumulation of collective knowledge at the small unit level. Lessons learned in one period often required relearning as experienced. Soldiers completed tours and returned home. Institutional memory existed primarily in written reports and after-action reviews, rather than in veteran crews who could pass knowledge directly to new arrivals. This system maximized individual fairness in combat exposure, but degraded unit effectiveness substantially. The strategic purpose of armored operations in Vietnam remained ambiguous throughout the American involvement. Armor could not seize and hold terrain in the traditional sense when enemy forces refused decisive engagement. Traditional measures of success in armored warfare, such as kilometers advanced or enemy formations destroyed, found no application in an environment where the enemy avoided direct confrontation with heavy forces. Area denial and attrition became operational objectives rather than breakthrough and exploitation. Tank crews found themselves supporting an overall strategy that did not emphasize the capabilities armor brought to conventional warfare. This disconnect between capability and mission created frustration and questions about the value of deploying expensive, maintenance-intensive armored forces to Vietnam. Weather patterns significantly impacted operations in ways that American forces in temperate climates rarely experienced. The southwest monsoon, from May through September, brought heavy rainfall to much of South Vietnam. Daily rainfall measured in inches transformed roads into rivers of mud. Rivers flooded beyond their banks, sweeping away bridges and creating impassable barriers. Tank operations during monsoon season often ceased entirely, with vehicles confined to bases or hard stand positions. Maintenance suffered as crews worked in constant wetness that promoted rust and electrical failures. The northeast monsoon, from November through March, affected different regions and created similar challenges. Operational planning required accounting for seasonal limitations that did not affect armored warfare in other theaters, creating periods when armor provided minimal combat value. Spare parts supply chains struggled to support armored units operating at the end of extended logistics pipelines. The M48 Patton shared few components with other vehicles in theater, requiring dedicated supply channels. Specialized parts required shipment from the United States when depot stocks in Vietnam were exhausted. Lead times measured in weeks or months for critical components. Units maintained deadline vehicles awaiting parts while operational demands continued unabated. Cannibalization became common practice, reducing one tank to parts source status to keep others operational. This approach solved immediate problems but reduced overall fleet readiness and created long-term maintenance challenges when cannibalized vehicles required restoration to service. Crew endurance suffered from environmental factors that affected every aspect of operations. Extended operations in extreme heat, high humidity, and constant stress degraded performance in measurable ways. Crews could not maintain peak alertness indefinitely under these conditions. Fatigue-related errors occurred in maintenance, operation, and tactical decision-making. Command decisions reflected exhaustion as much as tactical consideration. The physical demands of operating in Vietnamese conditions affected every aspect of armored operations, from basic vehicle maintenance to complex tactical maneuvers. Rest periods, when available, often proved inadequate for full recovery, creating cumulative exhaustion that built over weeks and months. The enemy adapted to armored presence with tactical innovations that exploited every weakness. Initially, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces showed reluctance to engage tanks directly, preferring to avoid contact. Over time, tactics evolved based on observation and experience. Anti-tank teams practiced engagement techniques that maximized the effectiveness of limited weapons. Mine employment became more sophisticated, with better camouflage and more effective placement. Ambush positions targeted known armor routes at locations where terrain channeled movement and restricted response. The learning curve worked both ways, but enemy forces operated in familiar terrain and maintained initiative regarding engagement timing and location, providing inherent advantages. Public perception of armored warfare did not match Vietnam reality, creating unrealistic expectations. Images of tank columns racing across European landscapes dominated military culture and popular understanding. Vietnam offered no such opportunities for dramatic armored maneuver. Instead, tanks moved slowly through restricted terrain, supported infantry operations, or sat in defensive positions. The disconnect between expectation and reality affected morale and institutional understanding of armor's role in counterinsurgency operations. Tankers trained for mobile warfare found themselves in positional operations, while the American public expected dramatic victories that Vietnam's strategic environment could not produce. Lessons from Vietnam influenced subsequent armor development and doctrine in profound ways. The experience demonstrated limitations of heavy armor in restricted terrain with clarity that no peacetime analysis could match. It highlighted importance of mobility over protection in certain environments, challenging assumptions about the primacy of armor thickness. The U.S. Army began exploring lighter armored vehicles with better cross-country capability, leading to vehicles like the M2 Bradley. Doctrine incorporated lessons about combined arms operations in close terrain, infantry armor coordination, and the limits of technology against a determined, adaptive enemy. These adaptations took years to implement fully and appear in training and equipment development programs. The M48 Patton served throughout the American presence in Vietnam, from initial deployments in 1965 through final withdrawal. Despite challenges, it provided capabilities no other weapon system could deliver in the same package. Its main gun offered firepower unavailable from infantry weapons or lighter vehicles. Its armor, while vulnerable to modern anti-tank weapons, provided more protection than unarmored vehicles. Its presence affected enemy decision-making and provided psychological support to friendly forces operating in dangerous areas. The question was never whether tanks had value, but rather how to employ them effectively in an environment that contradicted fundamental assumptions about armored warfare developed over decades. By the early 1970s, American armored forces in Vietnam had accumulated years of operational experience under unique conditions. Units developed techniques for crossing difficult terrain, conducting convoy escorts, and supporting firebase defense that worked within environmental constraints. Crews understood their vehicles' limitations and capabilities in jungle conditions through hard experience. Maintenance practices adapted to tropical demands, with procedures modified to address humidity, heat, and abrasive soil. Recovery procedures improved as units learned what worked in Vietnamese conditions. The institutional knowledge represented hard-won expertise in a challenging operational environment that would inform armored operations for decades. The withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam ended large-scale armored operations in Southeast Asia. Tanks returned to the United States or transferred to South Vietnamese forces who would employ them in the final campaigns of the war. The experience remained relevant to understanding armor employment in restrictive terrain and unconventional warfare. Vietnam demonstrated that technological superiority and heavy firepower could not overcome fundamental environmental constraints or substitute for appropriate strategy. Terrain, climate, and operational requirements determined effectiveness more than armor thickness or gun caliber in an environment where traditional measures of armored effectiveness did not apply. The struggle of tanks in Vietnam's jungles reflected a broader challenge facing modern militaries. Military doctrine developed for European warfare did not transfer seamlessly to Southeast Asian counterinsurgency operations. Armored forces trained and equipped for conventional operations found themselves supporting a different kind of war entirely. Adaptation occurred through experience and innovation, but the fundamental mismatch between heavy armor and jungle warfare persisted throughout the conflict. The lessons learned would inform military planning for decades, highlighting the critical importance of matching force structure to operational environment rather than imposing preferred capabilities on unsuitable terrain. If you enjoy military stories like this, subscribe.